There are children who learn to hold the world together long before they ever learn how to hold themselves, not because someone asked them to, but because the house felt safer when they stayed steady, because the storms died down when they stayed silent, because everyone else seemed to fall apart and someone had to stay calm. So they became the quiet protector, the one who swallowed their fear so others could breathe easier, the one who grew up practicing emotional triage in a home that called it maturity, the one who learned to stay small so someone else could stay afloat. And long after childhood ends, something strange happens. They still protect everyone around them, except themselves, because somewhere along the way, protection stopped being a role and became an identity they can't put down. There is a moment in every quiet protector's childhood when silence becomes more than just the absence of sound. It becomes a shield, a strategy, a way of surviving a home that asks for too much without ever saying it out loud. It often begins quietly. A slammed door, a parent pacing in the hallway, breathing unevenly, the subtle tremor in the air that feels like a warning. Children are sensitive to atmosphere in ways adults often forget. They notice the tension in the room before they understand the words that caused it. They feel the emotional temperature drop before anyone raises their voice. And somewhere in that early observation, a child realizes something profound. If they stay quiet, if they stay calm, the house doesn't break. So they begin to shrink, to soften their footsteps, to turn their laughter down a little, to choose their words with the precision of someone diffusing a bomb, not because they're naturally timid, but because they're adapting to the emotional climate around them. In a healthy home, silence is gentle, a resting place, but in this child's world, silence becomes labor. The invisible work of absorbing tension so it doesn't spill over. The quiet task of steadying themselves so others don't fall apart. They learn to read faces like weather patterns, searching for signs of emotional storms. Every sigh becomes data. Every shift in posture becomes a signal. Every closed door becomes a forecast. They become the watcher, the listener, the emotional barometer who knows when a parent is about to unravel before that parent even notices it in themselves. And yet, this vigilance goes unnoticed because it isn't loud, it isn't dramatic, it is soft, subtle, and nearly invisible. Adults praise them for being mature for their age, not realizing that this maturity is not a gift, it is a burden. A child shouldn't have to be the calm one, the responsible one, the safe one. But they fill that role anyway, because someone has to. In many families there is chaos, anger that flares unpredictably, sadness that lingers without explanation, or the quiet emptiness of adults who are physically present but emotionally far away. In such spaces, a child quickly learns that their own feelings are secondary, that their needs must be postponed, that expressing discomfort might add fuel to a fire they are already trying to contain. So they bury the discomfort, they silence the fear, they swallow the frustration, and they grow a little quieter each time. With practice, silence becomes second nature, not forced, not painful, just automatic, a reflex. Years later, this child, now older, will struggle to explain why certain things make their chest tighten, why they flinch at raised voices, why they apologize before speaking, why they choose peace even when they aren't the ones who disrupted it. They won't remember the exact moment silence became their armor, but the body remembers, the nervous system remembers, and the patterns that formed in childhood continue to shape their adult life. Because once a child becomes the quiet protector, they rarely know how to stop. They grow into adults who monitor the emotions of everyone around them without thinking. Adults who soften themselves to keep others comfortable. Adults who become the strong friend, the good listener, the one people rely on without ever asking how they are doing. The tragedy is not that they learned to protect. The tragedy is that no one protected them. But even in this heaviness, there is a tender truth. Their silence was never weakness. It was intelligence, sensitivity. an early attempt at love in a home that gave them no blueprint for safety. This chapter ends where their journey truly begins, at the exact moment silence shifts from habit to identity. A child who learned to be small because being small felt safer. A protector who never asked for the responsibility, but carried it anyway. Responsibility doesn't appear out of nowhere. It grows quietly, like roots spreading beneath a house, hidden, structural, shaping everything above without being seen. For a child who becomes the family's quiet protector, the roots are rarely obvious. They aren't always born in dramatic tragedies or explosive arguments. Sometimes they grow out of small, repeated moments that never look harmful from the outside. A distracted parent, a sibling who absorbs all the attention, wanted or unwanted, a household where everyone is too tired, too stressed, or too wounded to notice what the child is carrying. In these homes, the adults often have their own storms. A mother stretched thin by life, a father weighed down by work or unspoken grief, a sibling who needs more help, more care, more emotional space. And in the background stands the quiet child, watching, absorbing, adjusting. They notice the exhaustion before anyone mentions it. They sense the sadness that no one names. They feel the tension humming beneath the surface of family conversations. Not because someone explained it, but because they learned to feel what others ignore. Responsibility begins with a moment of awareness. They're not okay. And right after that comes a quiet conclusion. I shouldn't make things worse. So the child begins to erase their own needs before anyone has the chance to overlook them. They stop asking for help. They stop expressing disappointment. They stop expecting comfort. Not because they don't need it, but because they sense, intuitively, that asking would become another burden. Children don't think in complex, psychological language. They simply notice who cries, who yells, who withdraws, and who takes care of whom. And very quickly, patterns form. When a parent is emotionally inconsistent, the child becomes the steady one. When a sibling absorbs attention through chaos, the child becomes the easy one. When family members argue, the child becomes the diplomat. When someone breaks down, the child becomes the quiet witness, offering presence without being asked. They become what the family needs, at the cost of what they need themselves. Some families unintentionally choose a responsible child, the same way a body chooses a dominant hand. There's no discussion, no selection process. It simply happens. The quiet one, the observant one, the one who feels too deeply to add to the noise around them. They are the easiest to lean on because they won't collapse loudly. They won't demand emotional labor in return. Their resilience makes them seem strong, even when they are quietly overwhelmed. This is how emotional responsibility transfers from adult to child, silently, seamlessly, without anyone realizing the exchange took place. In some cases, the parent might even praise it. You're so mature. You understand me better than anyone. You're my rock. To a child, these words feel like love, but they are also instruction. Stay calm so I don't fall apart. Be stable so I don't have to be. Carry what I can't bear. Emotional roles become cemented long before the child understands what they mean. And slowly, the protector identity develops. The child becomes the one who notices the half-closed door, the tightness in someone's voice, the subtle shift in the room's emotional temperature. They become the first responder to tension and the last person anyone checks on. The home begins to depend on their quietness as if it were part of the foundation. They are the calm space in a house full of noise, the gentle buffer between people who clash, the one who knows how to de-escalate without ever being taught. Most heartbreaking of all, they internalize a belief. If something goes wrong, I should have prevented it. If someone is upset, maybe I caused it. If the house feels heavy, I should carry more. Responsibility becomes their default setting, a reflex before thought, an instinct before language. And by the time they grow older, The role no longer feels like a role. It feels like a destiny. This chapter ends at the point where their innocence begins to fade, the moment a child takes ownership of problems that were never theirs, simply because no one else did. Some children grow up learning the emotional landscape of their home the way others learn a second language, through immersion, instinct, and necessity. By the time they reach adulthood, their mind and body have already been shaped by years of emotional monitoring, not consciously, not deliberately, but biologically. This chapter explores what happens beneath the surface, inside the nervous system, inside the brain, inside the quiet patterns that define a family protector. Because long before they understand psychology, their body is already practicing it. For these children, hypervigilance often begins before they even know the word for it. Their nervous system becomes finely tuned to the smallest cues: the sound of keys at the door, the speed of footsteps, the tone that replaces the silence. In neuroscience, this is known as pattern recognition under threat, a survival mechanism. The brain learns to anticipate danger because unpredictability hurts more than fear itself. To the outside world, they seem calm, controlled, unbothered. But inside, their mind is always scanning. Who's upset? Who's withdrawing? Who needs something? What can go wrong? And how do I stop it before it happens? This is not worry. This is not anxiety. This is a biological adaptation. When a child grows up in a home where emotional storms are unpredictable, their brain begins to live in a constant state of readiness. The amygdala stays alert. The body stays slightly tense. The mind stays one step ahead of everyone else. Over time, this becomes their baseline. Not danger, but preparation. Another layer of psychology emerges: the fawn response. Most people know fight, flight, freeze. But children who become protectors learn a fourth response: to soothe, to calm, to appease, to regulate others so they don't have to experience the explosion themselves. It is not obedience, it is protection, an attempt to restore peace before anyone notices there was none. This is why they often grow into adults who say, "It's okay," even when it's not, who minimize their feelings, who swallow disappointment before it reaches their lips. Not because they lack emotion, but because expressing it feels dangerous, unpredictable, inefficient. They have been trained unconsciously to be the emotional shield. Another psychological pattern appears in their development: parentification. Not in the literal sense of taking care of the household, but in the emotional sense. They become the confidant, the mediator, the one who absorbs the emotional overflow from adults who never learned how to hold their own feelings. No one says, "Take care of me," but the child reads it anyway, in the tears, in the silence, in the strained smiles, in the sudden collapse after a long day. Emotionally, the child steps into the vacancy. They become the anchor that steadies the family, so subtly that no one sees the toll it takes. By adulthood, this becomes their identity. They are the friend who checks in first, the partner who senses mood shifts before words are spoken, the employee who takes on extra tasks without being asked, the one who keeps everything running smoothly. People admire their stability, their calmness, their maturity, but few understand that these traits were sculpted by stress, not ease, by years of emotional labor disguised as personality, by a childhood where they learned that safety depends on their ability to carry things quietly. This is why the protector struggles to ask for help, why they over-explain, why they feel guilty for resting, why they worry about disappointing people who aren't even aware of their internal pressure. To them, responsibility feels physical, like a weight pressed into their chest. It feels moral, like failing someone is a kind of emotional betrayal. It feels personal, because they grew up believing that peace depends on their performance. But beneath all of this lies a quieter truth. No child becomes the family's emotional anchor unless the adults around them are drifting. The protector's psychology is not a flaw. It is a response. A brilliant, adaptive, painful response. And in recognizing this, the quiet protector begins to understand something they were never told. They were never supposed to hold the house together. They were simply too caring to let it fall apart. There comes a point in every quiet protector's life when the weight they carry begins to feel heavier than the role itself. Not because the world has suddenly become more demanding, but because they have grown older, and the body can no longer disguise what the heart has been holding for years. The child who learned to stay silent becomes the adult who apologizes for taking up space. The child who monitored everyone's moods becomes the adult who anticipates disappointment before it happens. The child who carried the house's emotions becomes the adult who carries everyone else's. And slowly, something begins to ache deep inside them. It's not sadness. Not exactly. It's something quieter, like grief for a version of themselves they never got to be. As adults, quiet protectors often move through life with a strange mixture of composure and exhaustion. They are the ones who seem unshakable, but feel everything intensely. The ones who offer comforting words without being prompted, yet cannot bring themselves to ask for comfort in return. The ones who others describe as strong, reliable, emotionally mature, while missing the truth that these traits were born from necessity, not abundance. People lean on them easily, almost instinctively, because they give without hesitation, because they understand without explanation, because they know how to hold others without dropping themselves. But even anchors sink when the water rises too high. Inside, the quiet protector experiences a constant tug, a pull between wanting to finally rest and feeling responsible for holding everything together. This inner conflict is not dramatic. It's subtle, like a tightening in the chest that appears anytime someone needs something from them, like the way their mind automatically calculates whom they might disappoint before they say no, like the guilt that creeps in whenever they think about choosing themselves. There is a hidden resentment too, not loud enough to erupt, not sharp enough to shatter relationships, but present. A resentment shaped like loneliness, like invisibility, like the simple truth that they have always been there for others. But rarely, if ever, have others been there for them in the same way. Yet the quiet protector rarely names this feeling. To them, resentment feels ungrateful, selfish, wrong, so they bury it, along with the exhaustion, the unspoken fears, the unmet needs, the desires they have convinced themselves are too much, and the world continues praising them for their grace. Relationships, especially, reveal their inner conflict. They often choose partners who need emotional grounding, partners who lean, collapse, or depend on the protector's steadiness. At first, this feels familiar, comfortable, like stepping back into an old role that fits too easily. But with time, the imbalance becomes heavy. They give too much. They explain too much. They try too hard to maintain peace, even when the cost is their own emotional depletion. They don't raise their voice. They don't demand change. They don't express frustration. Instead, they withdraw into themselves and carry the relationship the way they once carried the house they grew up in. The quiet protector becomes an expert at emotional self-containment. Every hurt becomes an internal monologue. Every disappointment becomes something they rationalize away. Every unmet need becomes something they promise themselves they will deal with later. But later never comes, because someone else always needs more. The weight no one sees is not the tasks they handle, but the emotions they silence. It is the way they absorb tension to protect others, the way they compress their own feelings into manageable shapes, the way they convince themselves that needing less makes them easier to love. They don't break, not loudly, not visibly. Instead, they erode, slowly, quietly, the way cliffs wear down under relentless waves. And yet, beneath the erosion, there is still something soft, hopeful, waiting, a hidden part of them that longs to be chosen, to be cared for, to be held without earning it. This chapter ends at the threshold of the turning point. The moment when the protector begins to realize that their strength has been mistaken for invulnerability, and their silence for emotional security. A moment when the weight becomes too heavy to ignore, and something inside them begins to whisper, "I cannot hold everything anymore." There is a moment, quiet, unceremonious, when the protector finally feels the tremor beneath their own mask. It doesn't happen dramatically. There is no shattering sound, no sudden collapse. Often it begins with something small, a comment that hits too deeply, a task that feels heavier than it should, a moment when someone says, "You're strong, you can handle it," and a part of them whispers back, "Not anymore." But the whisper is so faint, they almost ignore it. Almost. The mask they've worn for years is not made of denial. It is made of habit, made of the belief that emotional endurance is their role, their purpose, their identity. But no mask, no matter how noble, can be worn forever. The first cracks appear in exhaustion. Not physical exhaustion, but emotional fatigue so subtle they confuse it for a bad day. A heaviness behind the eyes. A sudden urge to disappear for a while. A silent wish that someone, just once, would notice the tightness in their smile. The body speaks before the mind does. Their shoulders tense without reason. Their breath shortens during conversations that once felt effortless. Their chest tightens in moments that do not warrant fear. These are not weaknesses. They are signs of a nervous system that has lived too long in protective mode. But because they are used to scanning others, not themselves, they miss these signals until they accumulate into something undeniable. Burnout, numbness, tears they didn't expect, a sense of emptiness they cannot explain. For some, the mask cracks during a moment of overwhelming stress. For others, it happens during unexpected kindness. A friend asking, "Are you okay?" in a tone that feels too sincere. A stranger offering help without being asked. A moment of gentleness so unfamiliar, it destabilizes them. Because protectors know how to endure pain. But kindness disarms them. It slips through the cracks and reaches the part of them that has been deprived of softness for too long. In that moment, something inside them shifts. A realization forms, not loud, but undeniable. I am tired. I am lonely. I am carrying too much. This realization is frightening, not because it feels dramatic, but because it feels true. Yet even as the mask cracks, the protector resists. They tell themselves they're being dramatic, that others have it worse, that they should be grateful, that needing less makes them easier to love. This is the internal conflict, a desperate need for support and an equally desperate fear of burdening someone else. They stand at the edge of their own vulnerability, unable to step forward, unable to fully retreat. So the cracks widen. They find themselves snapping at small things, crying unexpectedly, feeling disconnected in rooms where they once felt grounded, no longer knowing if they're genuinely fine or performing fine. The performance, the role they mastered as a child, begins to feel heavy, unbearable, unsustainable. But here lies the quiet turning point. Cracks are not signs of failure. They are signs of truth surfacing. The protector begins to notice how deeply they long for someone to stay, to listen, to see past the composure, to understand the exhaustion behind the reliability, to recognize the person behind the role. This longing is not weakness. It is healing trying to enter through the places where the mask has broken open. The turning point isn't a dramatic revelation. It is a slow awakening, a growing awareness that being the strong one has cost them parts of themselves they can no longer afford to lose. For the first time, they begin to wonder, what if strength isn't silent? What if vulnerability isn't dangerous? What if I'm allowed to need someone too? This is where the chapter ends. On the edge of transformation, standing between the identity they've always known and the unfamiliar possibility of a life where they don't have to carry everything alone. The mask is cracked, and through the cracks, light begins to enter. Healing for a quiet protector does not begin with a grand decision. It begins with something smaller, almost unremarkable, a pause, a moment where they don't immediately say, "It's fine." A breath they take before automatically offering, "Don't worry about it." A brief stillness where they notice their own tiredness before pushing it aside. Softening does not arrive like a lightning strike. It arrives like a slow thaw. Ice that has been holding everything in place for years, finally beginning to melt at the edges. For someone who has spent their life stabilizing others, the idea of softening feels dangerous at first. Being strong has always meant being composed. Being good has always meant being available. Being loved has always meant being useful. So when they start to loosen their grip, even a little, it feels like they're breaking something sacred. They may start with tiny experiments, saying, "I'm not sure I can help with that today," and noticing how their heart races afterward. Letting a message sit unanswered for an hour instead of replying immediately. Admitting, quietly, to someone they trust, "Actually, it's been a lot lately." To anyone else, these moments might seem small. To the quiet protector, they feel monumental. Because for the first time, they are allowing the shield to lower, if only by an inch. Softening is not the same as collapsing. It is not giving up. It is finally letting the self that has been carrying everything have a place in the equation. They begin to notice their own body more clearly. How their shoulders rise toward their ears when someone says, "I need to talk." How their jaw tightens when they hear footsteps that remind them of old patterns. How their pulse quickens when someone hints at disappointment. These signals, once ignored, become information, not an accusation, not a verdict, just truth. And slowly, with this awareness, something changes. They stop treating their reactions as flaws and start seeing them as echoes of a childhood where safety depended on anticipating danger. Softening also means allowing new experiences of care, however unfamiliar. A friend insists on staying on the call a little longer, and instead of saying, "Don't worry, I'm okay," they let the conversation linger. A partner asks, "How was your day really?" And this time, the word "fine" feels too small to carry everything, so they add a little more. Not everything, just enough to feel real. They might sit in a room alone, feel a wave of sadness rise up, and instead of forcing it down with productivity or distraction, they let it crest. They let it exist. They let themselves feel it, not to fix it, not to analyze it, just to acknowledge that their inner world is as deserving of attention as everyone else's. The shield of silence, which once made them feel safe, begins to loosen its hold. They might still be the person others turn to, but the dynamic starts to shift in small, almost invisible ways. They ask, "Do you have space to listen?" before sharing something vulnerable. They notice who shows up when they are not the strong one. They begin to see which connections are mutual and which ones were built on their willingness to carry more. Softening does not mean they stop caring. It means their care is no longer one-directional. They start to understand that boundaries are not walls that keep love out, but doors that allow it to move in both directions. There is a quiet dignity in this stage. Not the polished dignity of being put together, but the tender dignity of being honest about what hurts. They may still feel guilty for resting, still feel exposed when asking for help, still feel the old instinct to say, "It's okay, don't worry about me." But now there is another voice within them, gentler, newfound, persistent, that whispers, "I deserve to be held too. I am not failing anyone by being human. I am allowed to be more than the role I played as a child." Softening, ultimately, is not about becoming less strong. It is about letting strength coexist with tenderness, letting responsibility coexist with need, letting care for others coexist with care for self. This chapter ends with a simple, powerful image, the quiet protector sitting with their own feelings, not rushing to regulate anyone else, not planning how to hold the world together, just being there with themselves, perhaps for the first time. In every quiet protector's life, there comes a moment, soft, almost imperceptible, when the world feels still enough for them to finally hear the child they once were. Not the composed adult they became, not the anchor everyone leaned on, but the younger self who spent years swallowing emotions to keep the home steady. This child does not speak loudly. They never learned how. Their voice is fragile, cautious, shaped by years of being overlooked. But when the adult finally pauses, when they stop tending to others long enough to listen inward, a faint whisper rises from deep within. I was scared. I was tired. I didn't want to be strong all the time. And in that moment, the protector understands something profound. The child who kept everyone safe was never truly safe themselves. Poetic closure does not come from blaming the past. It does not come from rewriting history into something crueler or softer. It comes from acknowledging what was true. They were a child who interpreted silence as responsibility, a child who mistook emotional instability for personal duty, a child who believed love was earned through steadiness, a child who felt older than their age, yet invisible at the same time. And yet, they survived, not by hardening, but by adapting, by learning to hold the house together with gentleness instead of force, by becoming a sanctuary in a home that had none. Their sensitivity, once seen as fragility, was actually intelligence. Their quietness, once mistaken for timidity, was actually intuition. Their emotional depth, once unrecognized, was the very thing that kept the home from collapsing. This recognition becomes a kind of warmth, a soft, slow-burning realization that the child within them never failed. They simply carried more than any child should have been asked to carry. In adulthood, hearing that inner child is both painful and liberating. Painful because they finally feel the weight of everything that went unspoken. Liberating because they no longer have to carry it alone. The quiet protector begins to see themselves not as a role, but as a person, someone who deserved gentleness long before they learned to give it. In this stage, the world feels different. The light falls differently on their life. The past, once a silent burden, becomes something they can examine with compassion instead of obligation. They begin to realize they do not need to earn rest. They do not need to justify softness. They do not need to prove strength in silence. They do not need to shape themselves around the emotions of others. Their worth is not conditional. It never was. The poetic closure of their story unfolds quietly. They start noticing small wonders, moments that once escaped them because their focus was always outward. The way morning light softens the edges of a room, the comfort of an unhurried breath, the unfamiliar but steady feeling of being supported by someone else, the permission to say no, not as defiance, but as care for their own spirit. Slowly they begin to reclaim pieces of themselves they left behind. A forgotten hobby, a tenderness they silenced, a dream they postponed because someone else needed more. The protector evolves, not into someone new, but into someone whole. The child who lived in hyper-awareness begins to rest. The adult who carried everyone's emotions begins to set them down. The protector who never asked for help begins to allow it. And through this gentle unraveling, something extraordinary happens. The quiet child is no longer alone inside them. They are finally seen, finally heard, finally allowed to take up space without apology. This is not a dramatic ending. It is a soft one, the kind that feels truer than any climax. Because healing, for someone who lived their entire life wrapped in silence, is not about breaking open. It's about opening gently. It is the moment where they understand that their voice, once hidden, has always been worthy of sound. That their needs, once buried, have always been valid. That their story, once carried alone in the dark, deserves to exist in the light. The quiet protector walks forward, not because they are unburdened, but because they finally know that they no longer have to carry everything. And somewhere inside them, the child they once were smiles for the first time, heard, held, and finally home.